and misinformation and deprivation. And so that's the 41 years. That's the way that Libyans have got accustomed to, and eventually they got tired of it, particularly the young people, as they see that they have no future. So they decided to rise up, and they are very determined, and I believe that they will reach what they want.
In international circles, Gaddafi has managed to rehabilitate himself to a certain extent over the past several years. Do you think that there is going to be international pressure in this context now on Gaddafi?
I'm not really sure that there has been a genuine pressure from the international community on Gaddafi, because each country, I think, it has its own interest. And of course, despite the problems that he's facing in the East in particular and in the West, people are turning a blind eye because they don't want to see their oil being interrupted. As long as they don't see an immediate threat, they will continue to play lip service, but really providing no real pressure. But I think the pressure will come once they sense that he is on the way out, just like they did with Mubarak. And they did with Ben Ali. Initially, they were siding with the tyrants, but when the people there prevailed, they shed them and they cast them aside.
Mohammed Begegis in Washington, D.C., thank you for talking to us. Well, let's give you a quick reminder about the man that we've been speaking about there, the man the protesters want to step down after more than 40 years in power. Muammar Gaddafi was born to nomadic parents in 1942. He left school early to join the army, and by 1969, he had enough support to lead a group of junior officers in a bloodless coup that ended King Idris's 18-year rule. By 1971, he had turned his back on the West and was supporting some groups they considered to be terrorists, such as the IRA in Ireland and the Palestine Liberation Organization. The United States carried out airstrikes on the cities of Tripoli and Benghazi in 1986, killing Gaddafi's adopted baby daughter. Sanctions were also imposed on the country in the 1990s. But in 2003, Gaddafi managed to win back some international favour. He accepted responsibility for the bombing of an airliner over the Scottish town of Lockerbie, and he stopped his nuclear programme and said he was no longer interested in weapons of mass destruction. Today, Gaddafi is the longest-serving leader in both Africa and the Arab world. Now, in Bahrain, security forces have opened fire on the anti-government protesters gathered in the capital, Manama, on Friday. Hundreds of mourners were marching towards Pearl Roundabout when the government forces opened fire. The wounded were taken to the city's main hospital in Salmania, where protesters have gathered to offer blood and support. Our correspondent in Manama reports.
The emergency room of Bahrain's largest hospital straining to cope as the first patients are treated. Doctors battle to save the most seriously ill. This man has a bullet lodged in his brain.
There was a rush of people, injured, casualties. There are hundreds of patients who were brought in the hospital. There are still people who are lying in the roundabout. There are still people who are thrown in the street. We don't know how many patients are there so far. And they've stopped the ambulances from going there again, once again.
For one doctor, the stress was too much. Some patients have clearly been traumatized by what's happened to them. Relatives are angry. This woman says she hopes God will bring down the Khalifa family. The hospital beds are full. These were unarmed protesters who'd been marching peacefully when the military started firing live rounds and tear gas at them.
They fired at us from all sides, using guns, rubber bullets and live ammunition. It came from everywhere, from the air, from the riot police and the Air Force. They used tear gas, really all kinds of weapons.
Outside the Salmania hospital, crowds began to grow. This had become a place of protest. Down, down, Hamid, a reference to this country's ruler, King Hamid. Hours after the troops opened fire, the injured were still being brought here to the shock of the crowd. Some of the protesters are already vowing to march again in the coming days. They say the heavy-handed tactics of the authorities will not stop them. AlJazeera, Bahrain.
Well, meanwhile, Bahrain's king says he has asked the crown prince to begin what he's calling a national dialogue with the protesters. Earlier, the prince appeared on state television, calling for calm.
I say calm down to the person who throws stones and to the person who shoots bullets. This doesn't serve anybody.
Do you want to withdraw the security forces from the street?
We are talking, the security forces, we are talking about controlling the situation. We cannot really do impulsive decision at this moment.
Now, in Yemen, at least 6 people have been killed during the latest anti-government protest. The so-called Friday of Rage attracted thousands of people to the capital, Sana'a. Demonstrations have now gone on for 8 consecutive days, with calls for the president to resign growing ever louder. And in Jordan, at least 8 people have been injured in clashes between pro- and anti-government groups. The fighting broke out in the capital, Amman, after Friday prayers. Protesters calling for more freedoms and lower food prices. This was the 7th Friday in a row on which Jordanians have rallied. And in Egypt, the ruling Supreme Council of the Armed Forces has said it will not tolerate any further strikes. The army's statement was issued on Friday as millions of people filled the streets across the country to celebrate their revolution and to maintain the pressure on the new military government to implement democratic reform. Rabia Raghi reports from Cairo.
Draped in red, white and black, thousands of Egyptians come to Tahrir Square, this time not in protest, rather to mark their hard-won victory.
Contrary to the scenes of anger and frustration that lasted here in Tahrir Square for days before Hosni Mubarak stepped down, the mood this Friday is one of joy and celebrations, smiles everywhere.
And a tribute to the country's military, who even before the end of Mubarak's rule last week was hailed for not obstructing the pro-democracy movement. The military had asked Egyptians to stop their protests, but it did not prevent the gathering on Friday. Instead, Tahrir was surrounded by tanks and soldiers who searched people and regulated traffic. The gathering not only a victory march, but also a memorial to the 300-plus people who lost their lives in the uprising. The highlight of the day, an appearance by Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi, one of Sunni Islam's most prominent clerics. In a heartfelt ceremony, he praised the revolution, the youth behind it, and the military, though he did make a direct request.
I call on the Egyptian army to liberate us from the government that Mubarak formed in his last days. We want a new government that does not include the old faces that remind people of poverty and misery.
But he also urged patience with the country's interim military leadership. The current cabinet was appointed by Mubarak